So in this video, I want to talk about the buy-to-let property sector and really the complete mess it's in. Because I think it's important for not just you 8.6 million renters out there, but also you 2.8 million landlords out there to really understand the knock-on effects of all these interventions the government's been taking recently. First with the introduction of the rental rights bill, but more recently with the autumn budget that I know you probably all loved. And really I aim to conclude this video with useful predictions and advice to not just you renters, but also you landlords on what I think's coming next, and importantly, what I would do if I were in your situation. And in case you don't know me, I think the unique insight I have in all of this is I founded a UK-wide home buying company, British Home Buyers, a nationwide estate agency, British Home Sellers, both back in 2012, and I still run those businesses today. And so through that, my businesses are literally dealing with thousands of property transactions a year, really spread all over the UK. So through that, I get a pretty good insight of not just the trends in a specific area like a local agent would, but really I'm constantly tracking the nationwide picture as well. So I want to start with how we got into this mess. How has the property market gotten into this really quite terrible position? Because that really paints the picture of where we are now and where we're heading in the future. Because ironically, we have both Conservative and Labour governments to blame for this, excuse my French, but complete shit show we're in. It all starts with Baroness Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady. You can see here, pre-Thatcher, the housing market was actually in a really good spot. Really, it's exactly where we should aim for the housing market to be today. Social housing volumes were slowly increasing, that blue area. The rental sector was slowly reducing, that red area. And home ownership, that big yellow zone, was rising. Stamp duty was only about 1 to 2% back then. There was no extra 5% stamp duty for second homes or property investments. So really at this stage, there was a healthy equilibrium in the property market. The buy-to-let sector was really kept at bay by the huge amount of social housing acting as a competitive force on rental prices, and also house prices weren't skyrocketing each year either. But more importantly, pre-Thatcher, there was a really healthy supply of new homes being built. Just look at how drastic the difference is between the 50s and 60s and 70s in comparison to the number of homes that's been built per year since. If we kept building at that same rate as the pre-Thatcher period, we were actually doing it, we'd quite literally be building at least 100,000 new homes a year right now. Which if that had kept going since over the last 45 years since, it would equate to 4.5 million more homes in our country today. Literally almost 20% more property than we've got right now in the UK. And you want to know something completely mad about this? Google what the shortage of property is in the UK today, and it's 4.3 million homes. So I really hope this helps cut through the rubbish that's out there. The issue isn't landlords, it isn't banks, it's supply. We had a great balanced market when we were hitting housing targets 45 years ago. We've now been short of those targets by the tune of 4.5 million homes over the last 45 years. And now we're 4.3 million homes short, which is what has pushed prices up for decades. That's it. Simple supply and demand problem. Everything else is just a distraction. It's just rubbish. So look, although I personally admire Margaret Thatcher, our first woman Prime Minister, the bold action she took incredible character to do at the time. But ultimately her leadership did trigger a massive sell-off of social housing via the Right to Buy scheme and really started the beginnings of the destabilisation of our property market. And they didn't backfill what was being sold off by continuing to build property, which is what led to the collapse in new homes being built each year. That really started the triggering of a downturn in home building. So when I look back at this distribution of housing stock, Just look at the legacy the Thatcher government left behind. New homes being built had literally halved. Social housing levels shrinking. But before we blame everything on the Conservative government, take a look at that red area, that private buy-to-let landlord sector in red. It hadn't really moved much over that entire time. So we actually can't blame Thatcher for the rise in the popularity of buy-to-let landlords. But she certainly paved the way. Because what do you think her tinkering with the property market led to? Quite a dramatic increase in house prices. It really doesn't take an economist to work out that if you reduce supply and incentivize demand through the right to buy scheme, with a financial sector at the time that was beginning to deregulate, making it far easier for people to get mortgages, you're going to see house prices skyrocket. When prices of any asset increase a lot, what then happens? It starts to get more and more noticed as an investable asset class because of how much it increases in value each year. Now, of course, this trend continued as John Major took over. No correction to the massive sell-off in social housing, and importantly, no intervention to re-kickstart the building of new homes. In fact, it fell even further. What a mess. But not as big of a mess as right now. Back then, yes, prices were rising, driven by the slowing in new homes being built, the sell-off of social housing, and the deregulation of home mortgages. But the buy-to-let sector of the market had remained largely unchanged until Tony Blair came along. As you can see, when Tony Blair's Labour Party took over, you can clearly start to see a drop in that yellow block, that block of home ownership, and an increase in the rental sector, as well as the continued drop in social housing Thatcher triggered. Yes, Conservatives destroyed our home building capabilities and sold off social housing, but at least that was resulting in the home ownership market growing in its place. Labour made things worse by kick-starting the buy-to-let revolution, but importantly did nothing to undo the wrong paths the previous Conservative governments had paved. They had taken the result, as you can see from that graph, home ownership going backwards for the first time, social housing continuing to go backwards, but the private rental sector booming. Now look, it's quite clear when David Cameron's Conservatives came back into power, the trend continued. But just take a look at what started to happen towards the end of David Cameron's time in office. Owner-occupied home ownership was beginning to rise again after having fallen, and the private rental sector was beginning to actually reduce again. So, to understand the future, we must understand the past. Thatcher's Conservatives allowed new home building to collapse and sold off our social housing. Blair's Labour Party then take over, fixing none of those mistakes with home building or social housing, but kickstart the expansion of the private rental sector. Rental market booms whilst home ownership drops for the first time. Then Cameron's Conservatives are actually the first to begin increasing home ownership again and actually decrease the rental sector by introducing things like the 3% second home stamp duty in 2016, Section 24 in 2017, the tenant fee ban in 2019. So the mad thing is, when people say Labour are anti-landlord and Conservatives are pro-landlord, I'm sorry, but you're wrong. Conservative policies pre this Labour government have been very pro-home ownership and anti-landlord. They've just done a good marketing exercise to convince us differently. The rental sector has been slowly contracting, which is what you want. You don't want sharp drops in rental property because that destabilizes things and rents skyrocket, which is ironically exactly what's happening right now. You want a gradual decrease in rental stock over consistent years and decades. And you want an increase in home ownership, home building over the same time. Fixing the property market is not a 4-year job. It will really take decades plus to slowly correct. If we can loop back to the balance of the supply and demand we saw pre the 70s, then we'd be in a great position. So let's talk about the rent crisis that's coming next year in 2025. And I want to start by talking about inflation, Not the inflation everyone's talking about linked to the Bank of England interest rates, but specifically rental inflation. Just look at this graph. Take a look at how, on the whole, between 2015 all the way to COVID, rental inflation was dropping and largely in line with inflation to earnings. Even though over that period the volume of buy-to-lets, like I mentioned earlier, had actually been dropping and home ownership had been increasing that time. If the contraction of the buy-to-let market is gradual and balanced with home ownership increasing, then that's what happens. But just look at the mess over COVID. Rents have skyrocketed, and although dropping, are still 5.4%. Why? There are now 24% less homes available to rent than before COVID, and the unaffordability of home ownership is forcing demand on less rental stock. So now you have this ridiculous situation where about 20 people are chasing every home for rent at the moment. And that's been rising since Labour came into power. So what's the solution? Stop tinkering with the property market that started this mess in the 70s to begin with. 100% focus on pushing supply of property building at all costs. Is that what's happening now? No. So what is going to happen? House prices will keep rising, rental prices will keep rising. It's really not complicated economics to any of this. There is this narrative of villainising the landlords as the enemy, muddying the reality of what has actually caused this mess. Rather than being transparent, that the fundamental problems with the property market have been caused by over 50 years of mismanagement of the property market, by not just Conservative governments, but Labour governments as well. Government has failed. For instance, pre-70s, stamp duty rates were used in exactly the same way the Bank of England uses interest rates to combat inflation. If house prices rose a little bit too quickly to 3% rather than 2% a year, they increased stamp duty a little to combat it. If house price inflation was a little low, they lowered stamp duty a little. There was a real focus on avoiding excessive house price growth, which then organically makes it an unattractive investment. Excessive growth in house prices is actually a bad thing for society, just like nominal inflation. But the governments over the last 55 years seem to have entirely forgotten about that. And now society as a whole is paying the price for it. Anyway, I almost forgot. What should you do now? Tenants, at all costs, get onto the housing ladder as quickly as possible because these problems aren't going away anytime soon. And landlords, don't panic sell. If you're patient, the mess that's unfolding will lead to higher house prices and higher rental yields, staying as interest rates begin dropping, which is going to unlock future profits in your buy-to-let portfolios. Anyway, share your comments. And as you can see from my previous videos, I literally reply to every single comment. And I'll see you in the next video up here.